70th session of the UN General Assembly is underway, and next week Chinese President Xi Jinping will make his inaugural address to the global body. But much has changed in the last 70 years, and as the UN marks its anniversary, it is on the back of worldwide economic uncertainty, an unprecedented migration crisis, and wide calls for more representation from developing nations. So as world leaders descend on New York, are African voices being heard? And how will the decisions made now impact on the future relationship between Africa and the United Nations? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to address the United Nations next week, Monday, his first address to the body since taking office. China's role in the body is seen by many to be on the rise, and their influence is something that African countries are taking note of. So will President Xi's visit to both the United Nations and the United States have any knock-on effects on this continent? And can the mutual cooperation between China and Africa be leveraged on the global stage?
It's a trip that begins in the northwest United States in Washington state, then moves across the country to Washington, D.C. for a state visit, and on to New York to deliver the first speech by a Chinese president to the United Nations General Assembly. The trip builds on the visit by the U.S. president to Beijing late last year, where both sides announced a historic climate change agreement. Since then, the relationship has been rocky. U.S. allegations of cyber hacking by Chinese nationals, Chinese concerns over flights by U.S. aircraft off the Chinese coast, and U.S. concerns over the Chinese economy and stock market. Some experts on the U.S.-China relationship think that President Xi's visit can go a long way to reassure the U.S. about Chinese policy. That has already happened. Ahead of President Xi's arrival, senior Chinese officials launched China Book Month by highlighting President Xi's thoughts on China's ambitious reform program. The Chinese speakers think that this visit can help explain China's economic shift. As both the Chinese and American presidents have found out before, there is no substitute for face-to-face meetings to try and forge what China calls a new model of major power relations, where a rising power like China can compete but also cooperate with the US. China is playing an increasingly positive role in regions around the world and very noticeably in Africa. But it remains to be seen whether this new model of major powers will be able to align both Chinese and US interests in African development.
Now, the United Nations office in Nairobi is one of 4 global UN headquarters and the only one in the Southern Hemisphere. Established in 1996, it provides support for various UN missions, including the United Nations Environment Programme and UN Habitat, and it is the first port of call for Africans wanting to interact with the global movement. UN Under-Secretary General Saleh Work Zewde also serves as the Director General for this office. I sat down with her to talk about the United Nations relationship with Africa and the body's importance on the continent. Madam Director General, thank you very much for giving us your time. First of all, let's start with the functions of the United Nations office here in Nairobi. How is the UN presence, though, felt on the continent?
The United Nations have been present here for quite some time. As you know, in developing countries, we have the United Nations country team dealing with many activities of the United Nations in that country. Kenya has it. We have a dynamic country team. But beyond that, and this is what is not really well known, we have 2 global programs, UNEP and UN Habitat, which has been created here like 4 decades ago, and which are the only global programs located in the Southern Hemisphere. We have the United Nations office at Nairobi, which I have the honor to head, which is one of the 3 offices away from headquarters, which are considered like the United Nations headquarters. This is an office which has been created to make more, economies of scale of what the UN is doing by administering the 2 global programs and many other UN entities. So we are this office. We have in this compound in Gigiri a number of regional offices for Eastern and Southern Africa. We have the Office of the Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region. We have the UN office supporting the AMISOM troops in Somalia, quite a number of them.
So you're talking about this is the only office that is representing the Global South. It is here in Africa, but is that presence on the continent though being felt?
Yeah, on the continent, we are in many countries. Apart from the country teams, we have peacekeeping missions, half a dozen of them, a little bit more. Unfortunately, some of the crisis areas are on this continent. We have special political missions for countries which have come out of conflict. We have political offices, regional political offices, one in Dakar and the other one in Libreville, dealing with the ECOWAS configuration and the ECAS for the Central African states, doing a great job in prevention, in mediation, which is very important, to prevent countries going into crisis. I think it's a good opportunity after that long presence to let viewers know that the United Nations is really present on the continent in its very different forms. Right. And this duty station, Nairobi, it's not only our presence, but it has been a hub for many activities. Many big meetings have taken place here. The Security Council has moved here at least twice to discuss regional situations. We have humanitarian activities from here, dealing with neighboring countries. So this has been a big hub, and it's the third largest UN presence in the world.
We're looking at the United Nations now celebrating its 70th anniversary. Has the United Nations, in your view, though, would you say the United Nations over the last 70 years has been responsive to the needs of the African continent?
Well, I think 70 years is a good anniversary where we really have to sit down and reflect on what has been done in order to do better for the decades to come. This is going on. I truly believe that the UN has been responsive to the needs up to its capacity. As I said, in many troubled areas, the peacekeeping forces have done a good job. In some, political missions as well. But at the end of the day, the world is changing, and we have to adapt to that change. And the United Nations definitely will have to change and to adapt to that as well. There is a big change initiatives, a lot of them, in fact, taking place in the Secretariat within the United Nations to make sure that we have a United Nations which is efficient, effective, fit for purpose, ready to face the new challenges that the world is facing. So as we move on, as we celebrate, we also see what we have done and build on the positive things. I truly believe that, we have shortcomings, but at the end of the day, if the UN didn't exist, I think we would have to invent it. It has done a great job, but this is also time for us to adapt and to move on. And this change has to come in many aspects, and I can tell you that, in fact, Nairobi Duty Station is a pioneer in that, in some change initiatives undertaken by the Secretary General.
You're talking about the UN needing to adapt now because times have changed. In terms of the needs of the continent today, in what ways do you see the UN needing to adapt to Africa's needs?
Well, for instance, since we are talking on the eve of a major event, marking a major event for humanity, the adoptions of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think this is something very important. In 2000, the UN General Assembly adopted the MDGs, and I think a lot has been done. We can discuss if we have done the proper things or not, but in general, I think in the global objectives have been met. This discussion that has been taking place for 3 years, I mean, among member states, to identify the goals that we can achieve, to have a more open, transparent debate on that, including civil society, MPs, the business, and trying to build partnership. To be very honest with you, I think 2015 has been a critical year for humanity, starting with the financing for development. The Addis Ababa conference has been the start. It cannot be the end, but it has opened avenues for, how we can finance our ambition. And that cannot be limited to what we are having. It's not about charity or getting development assistance. It's beyond, it's partnership, it's investing. So I think that we are in the right path. The General Assembly hopefully will be adopting them, and it will be for individual countries to adopt them and to domesticate and implement them. I think by 2030 the world will be better. And critical issues have been added that we didn't have in 2000. But after only, I would say, 15 years, we have seen the damage of what climate change can bring. So this dimension of environment and so on has been added in the SDGs. And I think that we have a good platform to start and move forward.
But African countries did not really meet the Millennium Development Goals. Is it feasible, though, to expect that they will be meeting the SDGs?
Well, many have met some of the MDGs. We have had many challenges along the way. Financial crisis was there, the fragility of some countries, and so on and so forth. But the SDGs is not a new chapter which will leave alone the MDGs. What has not been achieved will continue with the SDGs, so we will build on them. But that goes beyond. It addresses the root causes of issues. It has been, to my view, a more in-depth discussion, and member states have agreed on those goals. I would see the glass half full. We have had an amazing progress in the MDGs in countries where we couldn't expect much to happen, but still, there was a lot of progress. I think it's a good ground that you have to build the SDGs on.
All right, I just want to go back to the UN itself and to the anniversary of the UN. It's the 70th anniversary now, and one of the issues that Africa's leadership has been talking about is this question of reforming the UN Security Council, and they are talking about it being undemocratic, not responsive to the continent's needs. Is there a need, though, in your view, to reform the UN Security Council? Is that a genuine demand from the African leadership?
Well, I don't think it's only an African demand. The demand comes from other corners of the world as well. As I have said earlier, the United Nations will have to move to adapt, to change according to the world which is moving, which we cannot stop. That's very important. On the reform of the Security Council, I think there is a genuine demand there. I have seen it in my previous life when I was working closely with the African Union, and there is a dynamic force behind it. But I would say, and repeating what the Secretary General has said, that we need to reform, including the Security Council, to be more representative, more transparent, more open, and that expanding the membership could be the best way forward. And as I have said earlier, Africa is one of the regions asking for this expansion. So it goes with what I have said, that the world is changing. 70 years later, we have to see what the UN will have to do in changing. But that will be for the member states to decide.
It will be for the member states to decide, and Africa is not the only region asking for an expansion and more representation at the UNSC. But what would it mean, though, for Africa to get a seat at the UNSC?
I think it will be significant. You know, 70%, around 70% of the issues discussed at the Security Council level are concern the continent, are African issues. So I think it's very important to have the continent you're talking about being represented, as far as permanent members are concerned, of course. But as I said, this is a debate for member states to undertake. But what I can tell you is that the Secretary General has this position for quite some time, that the expansion is needed. In fact, recently he has also taken note of the resolution of the General Assembly in adopting a text for negotiation on the reform. So I think it's going in the right direction.
All right, Madam Director General, we'll leave it there, but thank you very much for your time.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
We're going to take a short break, but when we return, my expert guests will help unpack the past, the present, and the future of Africa's relationship with the United Nations. Stay with us.
There is a historic injustice that needs to be corrected at the United Nations. Africa is the only continent that is not represented in the permanent membership of the UN Security Council. We know it cannot be a decision of one member, but we are asking all members to support us in making sure that this historic injustice is corrected.
Well, that was the African Union Commission Chair, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, speaking of Africa's underrepresentation at the UN during Barack Obama's visit to Ethiopia earlier this year. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, in light of the UN's 70th anniversary, I have expert guests standing by to help further unpack Africa's relationship with the United Nations in Nairobi. I have political commentator Macharia Munene, and in Beijing, current affairs commentator Victor Gao. To you both, thank you very much for being on the program. Professor Macharia, to you first, though. The United Nations is now celebrating 70 years. It's 70 years of its anniversary. What's been the relationship like, though, for Africa and the United Nations?
Well, it started as a place of hope for African colonies because it became a forum for agitating against colonialism. And to that extent, the United Nations became a very good place to air grievances, although that was not the original intent when it was created. And it succeeded it helped to liberate the African colonies, such that in 1960, the UN declared the year to be the year of Africa, because so many African countries attained their independence at that time. And from that time, when the Africans joined the UN in big numbers, we saw geopolitical dynamics. For one, the tendency to refer to South Africa as Africa changed, and because the apartheid now became a big issue. The other thing that developed is that Africans came out very clearly in the understanding of the way the reality is, that the reality was China was the mainland China and not an island. And that's why the Africans were very active in ensuring that China took its proper place at the United Nations.
All right. Victor, though, President Xi Jinping will be addressing the UN General Assembly this year, though, and he will also be chairing a meeting on UN Women and Gender Equality. He will also be chairing another meeting on South-South cooperation. What is the significance, though, of President Xi's attendance of the UNGA?
Well, I would say President Xi Jinping's participation in the major events at the United Nations this year, which actually celebrates the 70th year anniversary of the defeat of fascism, is especially important, mainly because from the Chinese perspective, the international world order that we live in today is very much based on the victory legacies of the Second World War, where the Allied forces throughout the world got united in defeating fascism, Nazism, and militarism in Italy, in Nazi Germany, and in Imperial Japan. And these victory legacies constituted the foundation stone, the bedrock of the international security order. Therefore, I would say President Xi Jinping will talk about the world today as it is related to 1945, but also I would say he will be talking about tremendous amount of transformation, both politically as well as economically, which have taken place since 1949, and how the United Nations can play a more important role in ensuring peace and stability in the world, and also bringing greater prosperity to mankind as a whole. Talking about gender security, this is a big topic in China, because China, ever since 1949, since the People's Republic of China has been founded, attaches great importance to gender equality. And I would say, throughout the world, the Chinese women actually have one of the highest level of equality between the genders compared with any other countries in the world.
All right. Professor Macharia, though, is that your feeling as well, that the South-South Forum or the South-South is likely to play a more heightened role moving forward? And again, Africa voted for China in 1971 at the UN, though. How can Africa, though, today leverage on that relationship with China to make its voice heard better at the UNSC or at the United Nations system?
I think both sides need to explore points of convergence, of interest. There may be some divergence points, but more of the convergence points is the critical one. The South-South cooperation is important. I think it's more of an attitude that needs to be strengthened with substance, so that it's just not a talking concept. The driving for interest here is equity. Equity within South-South, and then equity within North and South. So when the South-South get together and have their act together, they can then be able to deal with the North in a more equitable way. At present, there is inequity in the way they deal. The North tends to be domineering, and the South tends to be dominated. And the changes that we are looking for is where there is some semblance of equity between the North and the South, and within the South itself, such that the disparities that are so clear, they get reduced. They will never disappear completely, but at least they can be reduced to acceptable levels.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to wind up in a moment, but I do want to get your sentiments, though, on another issue that is going to be adopted at the UN General Assembly here, and that is the whole question of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals here, which are replacing the MDGs here. 17 of them. Do you think Africa will meet these policies?
Now, these are aspirations. And the aspirations, in as much as the Millennium Development Goals were, and they were not all achieved. So what we have is a step up, maybe to be able to carry together some of those who are left behind, those who went ahead. And since the Millennium was not achieved, now the main thing is sustainability. To try and do those things that are sustainable and you can achieve within reasonable time, and then move forward. So you have a terminological change here. Instead of development, because it did not quite work, say now do those things that can be sustained, sustainability, which is a kind of a balance between those aspirations that some countries were opposed to, and those the aspirations that others wanted to, and so you find a balance. And that's why I think the terminology sustainability is crucial in the future in terms of thinking.
All right.
And especially on the area of the environment and climate change.
Victor Gao?
Yes, I think using China as an example, we are now talking a lot about sustainable development, especially in terms of caring for the future generations, preserving the energy resources and improving energy efficiency, and reducing the emission and pollution, and make environment as one of the key important factors to be considered when you set development goals. And I would say if we develop in such a way which degrades the environment, depletes the resources in a rapid manner without due care and regard for the future generations, then the development will not be sustainable, even if this generation may actually get the lion's share of the benefit, but future generations may actually suffer more. So sustainable development will be the most important form of development. I remember Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader in the 1970s and 80s, used to say, development is the hard truth. I would say if he were still alive with us, he would say, green development and sustainable development is the hard truth, is the soft truth, and is the smart truth. So sustainability will be the key driver for development and growth in the coming years and decades. And African countries in particular, and working together with countries like China, for example, we need to share our experiences, exchange notes, comparing notes to make sure that we are on the right path of development, making sure that future generations in our societies will benefit from what we do today and will not suffer from the wrong things we may commit today.
All right, very interesting insights, gentlemen, as we look at the United Nations, and Africa as the United Nations turns 70. But that's all we have time for this week. But we'll delve further into Africa and the United Nations in next week's program. To Professor Macharia Munene in Nairobi and Victor Gao in Beijing, thank you both for your expertise. And do remember, you can join the conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. Until then, goodbye.